In this lecture, we are going to have an overview of the nervous system. When we say nervous system, this includes various organs like the brain and the spinal cord, receptors of sense organs such as the eyes and the ears, and nerves that connect to other systems. I will also discuss the histology of the nervous tissue, including the two types of cells, the neurons for intercellular communication and the neuroglia or the glial cells, which is essential to the survival and function of neurons. The neuroglia also helps in the preservation of the structure of nervous tissue. Later, I will discuss how these nerve tissues generate and propagate action potentials, including synaptic transmission. We can divide the nervous system into two primary categories, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, or the CNS, is the central primary area of the nervous system. It includes the brain and spinal cord, as well as the nervous tissue, connective tissue, and blood vessels that are supporting the brain and spinal cord. The CNS process and coordinate sensory data or information coming from inside and outside of the body. It also gives motor commands in order to control activities of the peripheral organs. After evaluating the information it receives from receptors, it will generate motor commands where they are needed. In addition to this, the CNS is also the one responsible for our ability to learn, memorize, and process emotion. The peripheral nervous system is what brings all information or signals to the central nervous system. It includes all nervous tissue outside the CNS and the ENS. It also is the one responsible for delivering sensory information to the CNS and carrying motor commands from the CNS to the peripheral tissues. The peripheral nerves is the ones that will carry sensory information and motor commands. When we say nerves, it is defined as bundles of axons with connective tissues and blood vessels. Nerves can be either cranial nerves, which are connected to the brain, and spinal nerves, which are attached to the spinal cord. The PNS can further be divided into functional divisions. The afferent division carries sensory information to the CNS, so from the receptors in peripheral tissues and organs towards the CNS, and the efferent division will carry motor commands out of the CNS, so from CNS towards the muscles, glands, and adipose tissue. The PNS also have receptors. Receptors can detect changes in the body, and they can also respond to stimuli. Receptors can be neurons, or they can be a specialized cell or complex organs like the eyes or ears. Effectors are the target organs that will respond to motor commands. The efferent division of the PNS can further be divided into somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is what controls the skeletal muscle contractions, either voluntary or involuntary, like our reflexes. The autonomic nervous system is going to control subconscious actions such as contractions of smooth and cardiac muscle and glandular secretions. The ANS can either be sympathetic or parasympathetic. Sympathetic ANS have stimulatory effects, and it will trigger the fight or flight response, while the parasympathetic ANS have a relaxing effect, and it triggers the rest and digest response. In this picture, we can see the two bigger divisions of the nervous system. We can see the CNS division, which is the brain and the spinal cord. You can see the spinal cord at the center, and coming out of the CNS, we can see the nerves, highlighted in yellow. Those nerves are what we call the peripheral nervous system. Those are the nervous tissue outside the CNS and ENS, and their job is to carry sensory information towards the CNS to be processed, and then they carry out motor command, which is also called action or reactions. The enteric nervous system is considered as the brain of the gut, and their operation is involuntary. It includes neurons in enteric plexuses in the walls of the digestive tract. Plexus generates nerve impulses. Remember that earlier I've mentioned that peripheral nervous system includes all nervous tissue outside the CNS and the ENS. But if you've noticed in this slide, it indicates that one of the components of the peripheral nervous system is the enteric nervous system. This is because the enteric nervous system is once considered as part of the ANS. However, most of the neurons of the enteric plexuses function independently of the autonomic nervous system and central nervous system, although they also communicate with the central nervous system via the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. Some of the functions of the ENS are monitoring of changes in the GIT contraction and secretion, such as acid secretion from the stomach and secretion of hormones by the GIT endocrine cells. In summary, the functions of the nervous system can be narrowed into three basic functions, and that is sensory, integrative, and motor function. So here is a chart that summarizes everything that we've discussed so far. All the blue box represents the afferent division. So remember that receptors can detect changes in the body and they can respond to stimuli. As I have said earlier, a receptor can be neurons or they can be special sensory receptors like our sense of smell, taste, vision, balance, hearing, and touch. We also have visceral or somatic sensory receptors. So when we say visceral sensory receptors, they are receptors that are present in our internal organs, while the somatic sensory receptors monitors the skeletal muscle, joints, and skin surface. All of these receptors pick up on change or any type of stimulus, and they send those information through the peripheral nerves. Remember that the peripheral nerves are the ones that either access or exit the CNS. The peripheral system is the one trying to send signals to the CNS. So when you're sending signals to the CNS, we are accessing, meaning the afferent division is active during this time. The information will be carried through the afferent nerves or the peripheral nervous system into the CNS, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And it is going to process the information and decide what to do about it. Afterwards, a motor command may be sent out or it will exit through the efferent division. These are the motor nerves or the efferent nerves. The orange box represents the efferent division. So the efferent division is going to send a motor command to either the somatic nervous system or the autonomic nervous system. Remember that somatic nervous system is the one that controls the skeletal muscle, and the autonomic nervous system can either have a sympathetic or a parasympathetic response on the smooth and cardiac muscle and glands. Let us now move on with the histology of the nervous tissue. The nervous tissue is composed of two types of cells, the neurons and the neuroglia or the glial cells. Let us talk about neurons first. The neurons are the basic functional unit of the nervous system. It is the one responsible for sending and receiving signals to and from the CNS. It functions in communication, information processing, and control. And in order to understand how neurons work, we should first know what are the parts of the neurons. The neurons have three main parts, and that is the dendrites, the cell body, and the axon. The dendrites are short and highly branched processes extending from the cell body. These projections or processes is also called as dendritic spines. Dendritic spines is the one that will receive information from other neurons. They make up about 80% to 90% of a neuron's surface area. And the cell body is also called as the soma. Inside the cell body is where we are going to find the nucleus, the cytoplasm, which is also known as the perikaryon, the mitochondria, which produce energy for the neuron, and it also have a rough ER and ribosomes that synthesizes proteins. In the perikaryon, or the cytoplasm of the cell body, are protein fibers called the neurofilaments, neurotubules, and neurofibrils, and they give the cell body support and structure. There is also the nasal bodies. These are dense areas of rough ER and ribosomes in the perikaryon. So when you see clusters of rough ER and ribosomes, we call that nasal bodies. The nasal bodies make the nervous tissue appear gray, hence they are also known as gray matter. Coming off of the cell body is a long, slender axon. The axon is also filled with cytoplasm, also known as the axoplasm. The function of the axon is to propagate electric signals, or what we call the action potential. The plasma membrane that surrounds or covers the axoplasm is the axolemma. The axon hillock is the thick region that attaches the initial segment of the cell body. The axon collaterals are branches that come off of the axon, and the distal end of the axon will eventually branch into the fine extensions called telodendria, which is also called as the axon terminal. At the ends of the axon terminal are bulb-shaped structure, also known as the synaptic end bulb or synaptic terminal. Neurons can be classified based on their structure and function. Structurally, they can be classified as multipolar, bipolar, and unipolar. Functionally, they are classified as sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory neurons are afferent neurons, and their cell bodies are grouped in sensory ganglia. Ganglia is collections or clusters of neuronal cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. The processes or the projections of sensory neurons called afferent fibers extend from sensory receptors to CNS. The somatic sensory neurons will be the neuron that monitors the external environment, while visceral sensory neuron will be the one to monitor the internal environment. There are three types of sensory receptors: the interoceptors, exteroceptors, and the proprioceptors. Interoceptors are receptors that will monitor your internal system, such as your digestive and urinary system, and also your internal senses like when you are stretching or in pain. Exteroceptors are receptors that will monitor your external environment like temperature and also complex senses like sight, smell, and hearing. Proprioceptors are the receptors that will monitor position and movement of skeletal muscles and joints. Motor neurons carry instructions from the CNS to the effector organs via efferent fibers. The somatic motor neurons of the somatic nervous system will innervate skeletal muscles, and the visceral motor neurons of the ANS will innervate all other peripheral effectors like smooth and cardiac muscle or glands. Interneurons are mostly present in the brain and spinal cord, located between the sensory and the motor neurons. They are responsible for the distribution of sensory information and coordination of motor activity, and they are involved in higher functions like memory and planning, or our ability to learn. Neurons can also be classified based on their structure. A multipolar neuron have one long axon and several dendrites, and they are common in the CNS. All motor neurons that control the skeletal muscles are multipolar neurons. A bipolar neuron, on the other hand, have one main dendrite and one axon. They can be found in the retina of the eye, in the inner ear, and in the olfactory area of the brain. While a unipolar neuron have one single process that emerges from the cell body. That single process is the dendrites and the axon fused together to form one continuous process. The unipolar neuron is sometimes called pseudo-unipolar because they actually originated from a bipolar neuron. However, the fusion of the dendrites and the axon while it is developing is what makes it unipolar. The dendrites of most unipolar neurons functions as sensory receptors. The neuroglia are the ones that support and protects the neurons. Neuroglia, or the glial cells in the CNS, are the astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, and the ependymal cells, while in the PNS, we have the Schwann cells and the satellite cells. In this picture, you can see the neurons and the different neuroglia in the CNS. The astrocytes are the ones that support and protect neurons from harmful substances. They also help maintain proper chemical environment for the generation of nerve impulses. They also assist with growth and migration of neurons during brain development, and they also play a role in learning and memory, and help form the blood-brain barrier. If you look closely, you can see that the astrocytes have large cell bodies with many processes branching off of the cell body. And the main function of the astrocyte is to maintain the blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier is like a filtration system, and it is going to ensure that chemicals that is present in your general circulation are not going to access the brain circulation. It somehow separates the brain circulation from your general circulation. Astrocytes can also help repair damaged nervous tissue and guide new neuron development. Ependymal cells forms the epithelium that lines the central canal of the spinal cord and the ventricles of the brain. They also produce and monitor the cerebrospinal fluid, or the CSF, and if you look at the ependymal cells, you can see that they have cilia. The cilia will help circulate the CSF. The microglia are the smallest and least numerous neuroglia, and they have very fine little branches, and they can migrate through the nervous tissue, and their job is to clean up cellular wastes and pathogen. Oligodendrocytes have small cell bodies in few processes or projections, and they are responsible in the formation of myelin sheath. A myelin sheath is important in insulating some axons, and myelinated axons increases the speed of action potentials that is propagated from the neuron. A myelin is also the one that gives the nerves their white appearance. Parts of a myelinated neuron includes the internodes and nodes of Ranvier. Internodes are myelinated segments, while the nodes of Ranvier are the areas between internodes. This is also where axons may branch.